Hey guys, welcome to Mad Scientist BBQ. I'm Jeremy Yoder, and today I'm going to show you how to smoke one of the quintessential barbecue items, pork spare ribs. Before we get into the video, I want to take a chance to thank our sponsor, Skillshare. Now, I don't know if you can tell, but I am covered in metal dust, and I have no idea what my hair looks like because I spent the day learning how to weld. And if you ever learned how to weld, you know that if you're not a good welder, you become a good grinder, and that's where all this dust came from. Now, what Skillshare offers is a community of millions of people and thousands of classes where you can pursue your interests and find things that capture your attention or things that you've always wanted to know how to do but have never done. Right now, I'm taking a class on iPhone filmmaking by Caleb Babcock and Niles Gray, and it is phenomenal. Now, the reason I'm taking that class is because I'm planning a hunting trip this fall, and I want to film it so that I can kill some wild game and use it for barbecue. This class is exactly what I need because I can't carry a bunch of camera equipment along with me as I'm hiking up and down mountains. It's just not going to work. The other problem is I don't know how to use this camera. Full disclosure, I do not even know how to turn on the camera. My wife does all the filming, and so this is a class that I desperately need. Now, the first 1,000 subscribers who click on the link in the description are going to get 2 free months of a premium membership to Skillshare. And what you could learn in those 2 months is incredible. Also, if you find that it's totally worth it, as it's going to be because it's $0 for 2 months, you can get an annual membership, which is less than $10 a month. Now, if you can spend less than $10 a month to get guaranteed quality stuff with no ads and a great user experience, Skillshare is the way to go. The link is in the description. I've done a video in the past where I show you how to make pork baby back ribs, also called loin back ribs, but I've kind of settled on pork spare ribs as the superior ribs to cook. Now, they can both be done extremely well, and this method works for both of them. But what's changed in the time since I did that video is I have made, I don't know, probably thousands of racks of ribs on the smoker behind me, and I've kind of dialed in the process to exactly what I like. Now, this might not be what everybody else likes, but this is what I found to be the best and the most popular when I do, barbecue pop-ups and catering events. People go nuts for these ribs, and I find that I like them the best too, so it's kind of a win-win. Also, this is, to me, kind of quintessential barbecue. You get real smoke flavor, you get fat render, you get some barbecue sauce in the end, you have salt and pepper, you have all of the elements that you really want in barbecue. And because barbecue is really the only uniquely American style of cooking, it makes me really happy to do it this way, and it's just so tasty that I can't help but do it this way every time. Now, I've tried tons of different rubs, I've tried tons of different sauces, I've tried a lot of different methods, probably 30 or 40 different cooking methods on these, and this is what I've settled down into. What I was doing for a long time was using cooks that I did for catering, for pop-ups, as experiments. So I never did anything super crazy, but I would try to tweak the method every single time, changing only one thing at a time to figure out if I like it or I don't like it. And this is the method that I've settled on, and this is the method that I'm going to share with you. Now, there are a couple different things that I want to address. Number one, the kind of cooking people do in their backyard is going to be different than what people do in competitions, which is going to be different than what people do in restaurants. So those are kind of 3 streams of barbecue styles. But what I want to do is give you the best backyard version of how to make pork spare ribs. I want to basically address the 2 different cooking styles that we're not going to be focusing on today. The first one is competition barbecue, and this is a mistake that I fell into and I see lots of people fall into. They try to do their own backyard cooking competition style. Well, the problem with that is in competitions, people are only taking 1 bite of whatever that barbecue item is and scoring it. And so it's not going to be the same kind of food that you'd want to make a meal out of. And what ends up happening usually when people do competitions with ribs is they'll use a very complex dry rub and they'll rub it a lot, and then they'll put it in the smoker for maybe 3 hours or something like that. And then they will wrap it with, margarine and brown sugar and all kinds of sauces and a bunch of stuff. And then they'll take it out of the wrap and maybe glaze it with the sauce at the end. What ends up happening is you get too much going on. Some people even inject ribs. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and it's good for a bite, but it's not good for a meal. Now, with restaurant style cooking, what happens a lot of times is in order to keep things very simple, because they're doing, tons and tons and tons of food every single day, what they might do is they might just keep it as simple as possible, just so that there aren't layers of complexity in what they're trying to produce consistently day after day and on time. So what they'll do is maybe just salt and pepper, throw it on, wait until it gets good color, it's starting to get tender, and then pull it off. that's probably not ideal for what most people want at home. So the backyard cooking style is kind of somewhere in the middle. You might take more care in doing backyard cooking than you would with restaurant style cooking, but you're not going to go through all the craziness of competition style cooking. So all that's to say is try it this way. I bet this is the way you're going to be doing it in the future. Now the last note, the ribs themselves. These are St. Louis spare ribs. Unless you are very skilled or you've done tons of ribs and you just want to get the full spare and trim them down to exactly what you want, I would suggest starting off with something like this. St. Louis spares. This method also works for baby backs, but I think it's the best with St. Louis spare ribs. Other note, if you get these at the grocery store, make sure that they're not filled with some kind of solution. If you've ever cooked ribs and it tasted just like ham, it's because it's filled with some kind of moisture solution that is going to make the meat taste different than just the pure meat by itself. So avoid that. Just get unadulterated, completely normal, non-seasoned St. Louis spare ribs, and this method will be a winner every time. Now the first step is taking them out of the package, and for some reason spare ribs almost always, in my experience, come in 2 packs, which is totally fine with me because I don't want to go through the trouble of cooking them if I'm only going to make 1 rack. So 2 pack, let's open it up and take a look at what we got. Now the beauty of doing St. Louis spares is there's not a lot of trimming involved. Sometimes you'll get just a bone shard like this is right here. I'm going to take that guy off. But really, you don't have to do much trimming at all. If there are little chunks of meat that are hanging off, you can take that off. But really, these are pretty much ready to go. The only question is, how are you going to deal with this membrane that's on the back of the ribs? Now there are 3 options to deal with when you're cooking ribs. Number 1, you can remove the membrane on the back. Number 2, you can score the membrane on the back. And number 3, you can just do nothing to the membrane and throw it on the smoker after you've seasoned it. There are benefits and drawbacks to each one. If you just leave the membrane on there and do nothing, it's the easiest thing in the world. You season it, throw it on, done. Number 2, if you remove the membrane, well, now you don't have anything that's going to be kind of snapping at the back of the rib, and when you take a bite, that is. And the drawback is it takes a long time. Like if I'm doing 40 racks of ribs, that's going to take a long time of me just pulling membranes off, pulling membranes off. There are tricks around it. You can use a butter knife to get under the membrane, use a paper towel to pull it off. But it's going to take a long time if you're doing anything more than 3 or 4 racks. And then the other option is to score the membrane on the back. So you go with your knife this way and then this way. And basically you're breaking that membrane up into little squares so that whenever you eat the rib, you're not taking off a huge chunk of membrane with any one bite. So that's kind of the middle ground in between those options. Now, my preferred method is to score the membrane on the back. And this is typically what you'd find at a restaurant because they're doing lots of ribs and they don't want to take a long time to get them ready. If you're doing competitions, I think everyone removes the membrane on the back of the ribs. Now, in my experience, if you cook the rib to proper tenderness, that's not going to matter at all. You might be able to tell that it's there, both by looking at it and then maybe by biting into it, you can tell that it's there, and that might matter in a competition. Maybe they'll get scored down for not removing the membrane. But I've never had anybody complain about the membrane being on ribs if they've been cooked to proper tenderness. So what we're going to do today is we're going to score the membrane on the back of the ribs because I think it's just as good as removing the membrane, but there's one thing that it doesn't do that removing the membrane often does. When you remove the membrane on the back, a lot of times you'll expose a bone completely. It's called a shiner. And while you're cooking it, a lot of times that bone can fall out. That bone just looks ugly. It's not just that bone. Sometimes it can happen to multiple bones in the process because a lot of times the membrane doesn't pull off evenly. I just try to avoid that entirely, and I think you get a more consistent product and you get it more easily if you simply score the membrane on the back of the rib. So I'm going to show you how I do one of these, and then you can recreate that at home. So first I do some cross cuts like this. It helps to have a very sharp knife. And then I make downstrokes, usually between the bones themselves. But it doesn't necessarily have to be between the bones. You can do it on the bone, whatever. Just small squares so that any one bite is only going to be pulling off a square of membrane rather than a whole huge chunk of membrane. And once you've done that, you're ready to start seasoning and getting this thing on the smoker. What we're going to use to season today couldn't be any simpler. It's 50% salt, 50% pepper. And the reason I'm using this is twofold. Number one is because it doesn't distract from the flavor of the pork. Number two, because it allows smoke to penetrate the meat. Now you might think, well, if you're going to put it on a smoker, of course the smoke is going to penetrate the meat. That's what you would think. But in my experience, using tons of different rubs, basically the rubs that taste the best often have a lot of fine grained powders in there. And when you put it on the ribs themselves, somehow it covers up all the surface area of the ribs and you don't get very much smoke flavor, no matter how long you put it on the smoker. I don't know if the reason behind it is just simply covering up the surface. I don't know if there's some other things involved. Maybe it masks the flavor of the smoke. I don't know what it is, but basically, when you use those fine-grained rubs, you just don't get as much smoke flavor. It just never happens. I've tried tons of different rubs. I've made my own. I bought a ton. And for some reason, the best smoke flavor always comes with just salt and pepper. I think that's because there's not that much pepper, and then the salt dissolves and penetrates the meat, and so you have a lot of exposed surface to absorb smoke. And if you're smoking meat, you want to taste that smoke flavor. Now, if you're dead set on using rib rubs, I have a video where I compared a ton of different rubs, and some are great, some are okay. My preference, of course, I'll tell you right now, is salt and pepper, but you get to see what those are like. I did it at the BBQ HQ. I'm going to link that video in the description below so you guys can go check it out if you're interested in trying those. It's totally worth trying, but I always come back to salt and pepper, and that's why I'm recommending it right now. Now, to me, these are perfectly rubbed ribs. A couple notes: use coarse ground black pepper and use kosher salt. Kosher salt, because you can see it and they're large grains, you're less likely to oversalt the meat. And coarse ground black pepper, because it's about the same size and mixes well, and when you put it in a shaker, it comes out pretty evenly. Now, one word of warning. With ribs, because they're a thin piece of meat, it's very easy to oversalt them. You don't ever want to go nuts with the salt. You want to make sure that you get an even coating, and when the pepper, which is what you can really see very well, looks about like this, I found that it's just perfect for my taste and for most of the people who come to my pop-ups and the people who eat at my catering events. I found this is kind of the winning combination right there. At this point, we're ready to put it on the smoker. We're going to start these ribs at 200 to 225 degrees, so pretty darn cool. And the reason is I want these things to absorb a ton of smoke flavor before they're actually finished cooking. Now, you've heard of the 3-2-1 method probably for ribs, where you go unwrapped for 3 hours, you wrap them for 2 hours, and then unwrapped again for an hour. In my experience, doing that a ton of times when I was first starting out in barbecue, I found the ribs to be overdone a lot of times and didn't have, a clean, good smoke flavor. And so I just eventually abandoned that method, and I just don't think it's ideal. What we're going to be using basically is something more like a 4-1 half, something like that. It's variable. You have to judge it based on how the meat looks. But the first part of the process is we're going to go probably 4, maybe even 4.5 hours unwrapped, so that we get great smoke flavor and great fat render. But that initial part unwrapped has 2 portions. The first one is cool part of the smoker, 200 to 225 degrees, just absorbing smoke flavor. And then what we want to do is we want to move it to the hot part of the smoker, because then it's going to cause the meat to contract and really plump up on the bones, and you get a better look and you get better fat render when you do that. At that point, we're just looking for tenderness, because we've got plenty of smoke flavor, we've got good fat render, we have nice plumped up ribs, it's pulling back from the bone, it's going to look very appetizing. At that point, we wrap them in aluminum foil for maybe just an hour, because they're already going to be 190, maybe even 200 degrees. And so in the foil, we're just going to steam them basically, get everything nice and tender. We don't want it to be mush, but we want it to be really, really tender so it's bite through. We don't want it to, fall apart, but that's one of the reasons I don't do the 3-2-1 method. I do it this way, because wrapping is like hyperdrive for cooking ribs. After they get to the right level of tenderness, we're going to pull them out of the wrap, and they start to cool down rapidly because they're going to be covered in moisture. Just think about when you're sweating and you're outside and there's wind moving, you cool down quickly. Well, there's going to be wind moving in the smoker, essentially, so it's going to drop the temperature of the ribs. So at that point, that's when we're going to glaze with a sauce. And it's not going to keep making the ribs hyper tender, going to turn them into mush, because they're actually going to be dropping in temperature at that point. So we glaze it with sauce, we get the smoker nice and hot to make the sauce thicken up and set, and at that point we remove them, slice them, and eat them. That's the game plan for how we're going to treat these ribs. So for the first 4 hours or so, all we have to do is maintain temperature and burn a clean fire. And the reason we want to burn a clean fire is because the quality of smoke that we want to accumulate on these ribs is very important. We want it to be delicious, and clean fire is the reason why people love barbecue. And if you want more information on that, I'll link a couple videos that I've done on that in the description as well. Now, with all that said, I know it's long-winded, but there's a lot of time and effort that I put into this. All that said, we're going to check back in probably 2 or 2.5 hours. At that point, we might start spraying, just depending on how they look. But because this is in the cool part of the cooker, we probably won't have to spray at all. Okay, so at this point we have to check on the ribs. It's been about 3 hours, and we need to see if we need to make any adjustments. So do we need to spray? Do we not need to spray? And we can only answer that question by opening up the door and taking a look at these ribs.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, this is what we've got. Now we're starting to get great color on the outside here. It's looking really good. I might give them 30 more minutes or so. And just turn them around. We're starting to actually render this fat pretty well. But you see here, the meat is starting to crinkle up a little bit, starting to crinkle up there, which means it's starting to dry out. So that means I'm going to start spraying about every 15 or 20 minutes at this point. So let it go for another 30 or 45 minutes, bringing the total time to 3.5, 3:45. And yeah, we're just going to spray and try to keep these guys moist and add just a little bit more color and smoke flavor. The spray that we're using is half water, half apple cider vinegar. And I found that I get the best results when I use the vinegar, and I just use half water because it makes the vinegar last longer. And I use that on pork, I use it on beef, I use it on basically everything that needs to get sprayed. I would suggest that you try it, and hopefully it works as well for you. All right, it's been another 30 minutes, so we're 3.5 hours in, and I'm gonna guess that we have the color that we want, and therefore the smoke flavor we want. So we're gonna take these ribs, put them to a hotter part of the cooker, and cook them at 275 to try to get them to pull back from the bone. But let's take a look. Yeah, perfect. This is exactly what I'm looking for. Nice and juicy, fat starting to render. So I'm gonna put them on the top rack. Up there it's 275. All right, so we're gonna let those guys go at 275 for about 30 minutes probably, and I'm gonna spray them now, and then 15 minutes in, and then again at 30 minutes. But let me spray them now with some of this vinegar spray, and we're gonna let them start to plump up and hopefully pull back from the bones. Now, one side note is, this doesn't always happen, but usually it does. All right, after an hour on the smoker at 275, we've gotten the pullback on the bones that we wanted to on these ribs. Now, this is partially for an aesthetic reason because it looks nicer when you see pullback on the bones, but it's also for a different reason because it plumps up the meat and then makes each bite meatier and you get more meat. It's a thicker chunk on every single bone. So it looks better and then ultimately it eats better. So those are the two reasons why I want to get that pullback on the bone. It's totally not necessary. I just like it and I think it improves the overall experience. So we're taking it out, we're wrapping it in aluminum foil, and this is what you do. You take it, you put it meat side down on the aluminum foil, and I add some of the vinegar spray to the wrap itself because that's going to make sure that the whole environment stays moist. But there is one thing to note here. Adding the liquid will cause some of the color to kind of fade away a little bit. It washes away a little bit of the color, but if you already have a nice dark color to begin with, that's no problem at all. It should still be great at the end. All right, now back on the smoker, still at 275, but only wrapped for about 30 minutes or so. So we'll check on it after maybe 20, just depending on feel. After you've done enough of them, you can pick it up and say, oh, this is done or it's not. But probably check after 20 minutes. It'll probably be done by about 30. Okay, it's been about 30 minutes, so let's check on these ribs. All right, so I'm gonna pick it up first because when I pick it up, I want it to feel like it just gives. This one feels done. This one feels almost done. All right, so I picked these up and they felt good, so I unwrapped them. And one kind of easy test that you can do to see if your ribs are about ready is if you pick them up and it starts to break. On these, you can see we still have great color on the exterior, but where I try to pick them up, they started to want to break. That tells me these are the right level of tenderness. At this point, all we have to do is glaze them. We've gotten the smoke flavor on the exterior. We have really good color. We've got pullback from the bones. We've got tenderness that we wanted now, and now all that's left is glaze on the outside. So by just using a simple rub like salt and pepper at first, you get the smoke to penetrate the meat. And now with the sauce, whatever sauce is your favorite, we get that kind of symphony of all those different flavors together. So that way you don't have to cover up the rib with stuff that's going to prevent smoke from penetrating the meat. To me, this is the best of both worlds. You get the sweet and all the spices you want in your sauce to cover the exterior surface of the meat, but you don't sacrifice that smoke flavor. One other thing, if you're not sure if the ribs are done, you can take a digital instant read thermometer. I love the Thermopens. I spent way more money on cheap thermometers that kept breaking than I would have spent on a Thermopen in the beginning. It's 100% worth your investment. I'll put a link below. I love these things. But what you can do is just on the back side of the ribs, if you just poke through, we're not looking at temperatures here. We're just looking for feel. If it feels nice and soft going through, it's done. It's ready to go. And these feel great. If you actually read the temperature on this, it'd probably be right around 200 degrees. But that's just a quick and easy way to see if you have the tenderness that you want. So at this point, just paint sauce over the top. Any kind you like. I like Sweet Baby Ray's, so that's what I'm using today. There's some sauces that I like to make to use that are a little bit, we'll call it different. I like spicy, so I like to make a nice and spicy sauce. But whatever sauce you enjoy, use that. So we're just going to paint some of this on the top, and then we're going to go probably 20-30 minutes back on the smoke just to let this thicken up and really set on top of the ribs. All right, we're going to check back in about 20 minutes to see how this glaze looks. After 30 minutes glazing on the smoker, these ribs are now done. Pulled them out, put them on the cutting board, let them rest for 20 minutes. And as you can see, you don't need paprika in your rub to get great color on ribs. And finally, the reason we need to let them rest is because if you cut into them when they're still super, super hot, the edges of where you cut will dry out really fast. So it's important to let them rest a little bit, let juices kind of redistribute. And then also, it kind of allows the temperature to be low enough that you can, first of all, eat it right away, but then also the outside doesn't evaporate all the water. So all we have left to do now is cut one of these off and eat it. As you can see, we still have juicy ribs here. We have the glaze on this side, and we have a little bit of smoke ring on the top and the bottom, and hopefully these are going to be delicious ribs. All right, so here we have a rib, and my mouth is watering getting ready to eat this, but you see the glaze on the top looks beautiful. It's a very attractive rib, and now we got to taste it. That's good. As you can see, we have a clean bite here, so we have the ribs not falling completely apart because you don't want them to be mush. But then also underneath you see clean bone, which means that the meat is not sticking to the bone. It should be a perfectly tender rib, and the bite that I had was. And then finally, when you're done with your ribs, the bone should look like this. Nice and clean. There's not a bunch of meat still sticking on it. That means that you've cooked it to proper tenderness. Now, I hope you guys all get out there and try to make your ribs this way, and then let me know what you think in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find more fun and informative barbecue content. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Mad Scientist BBQ. I'll see you guys next time.